Her water broke, but she didn't wake her husband. Instead, she quietly got up and walked into the forest. By the time her husband and brother found her, she had already given birth, lying pale on the barren ground. After his initial excitement faded, the husband quickly fell into a state of deep confusion. He realized he now had to shoulder the heavy burden of supporting a family, and he could no longer just drift aimlessly. His father, doing dead-end work in their small village, harshly scolded him. As the old saying goes, a scholar is useless in practical matters. He was often mocked by others. Apart from knowing how to read a few words, he couldn't accomplish anything else. He wanted to make a living writing plays, but he would rack his brain and barely squeeze out a single line. Agnes did not blame her husband. Instead, she gently comforted him. One day, she went to her brother and said that her husband didn't belong in this small town. Staying here would only allow life to crush him. He needed to go to a broader world to showcase his talents. Her brother disagreed, arguing that Agnes was pregnant again, and this was the exact time she needed her family. Yet he believed that the useless husband just needed a proper job. Packing his bags, Agnes reluctantly sent her husband off. Soon, her due date arrived. Agnes packed her things, preparing to go into the forest to give birth again, but her mother-in-law stopped her. The river had burst its banks. It was too dangerous to go out now. She struggled desperately, but to no avail. Just then, the floodwaters seeped into the house, and she was still agonizing over her husband's safety. Amidst the pain and anxiety, Agnes gave birth to a baby boy. Just as everyone breathed a sigh of relief, they noticed her stomach was still bulging. Realizing it was twins, they quickly helped her back onto the birthing stool. Agnes fell into a massive panic. She was known as the daughter of the forest witch, an identity that made her an outcast, but also gave her a special ability. She could see things others couldn't. In her blurry premonitions, she foresaw that on her deathbed, only 2 children would be by her side, but now, she had a 3rd child in her womb. This meant one of them was destined to die early. A despair and helplessness completely overwhelmed her, made worse by the fact that her husband wasn't there. Agnes recalled watching her own mother pass away when she was a little girl. She had felt exactly this desperate back then. The 3rd child was finally born. It was a girl, but the expected crying never came. The maid assumed the baby was stillborn, and her mother-in-law urged Agnes to accept reality. The priority was to take care of the crying baby boy, but Agnes refused. She forcefully took back the lifeless baby girl and held her tightly against her chest. In her warm embrace, a miracle happened. The baby girl responded to her mother with a faint struggle. Agnes wept tears of joy, but the dread of her premonition immediately turned into an intense obsession. Time flew by. The twins grew into mischievous children. They loved swapping clothes, dressing up as each other pranked their family. Though the family knew exactly what they were doing, they lovingly played along with their games. In their free time, the 2 daughters learned about herbs from Agnes, while the son trailed behind his father, fantasizing about being a master swordsman. However, happy times are always fleeting. Her husband, William, had secured a stable job in London and couldn't always stay in their small town. He wanted to change the reality of them constantly being apart and prepared to move the whole family to London, but Agnes refused, because that terrifying premonition haunted her every single moment. She was extremely worried about her youngest daughter's health, as Judith often suffered from chest congestion. The smoggy air of London wouldn't suit her. At the same time, she felt guilty towards her young son. She knew Hamnet desperately wanted to go to London to work in the theatre with his father and play the role of a handsome swordsman, but she had no intention of changing her mind, because in her visions, Hamnet would grow up safely and achieve his dreams. The only thing she needed to do was fiercely protect Judith, ensuring that awful premonition never became reality. But what is destined to come, will come with the plague swept out of London and drifted into their small town. One day, Hamnet ran home excitedly, intending to go out and play with Judith, only to find her lying motionless in bed. By the time Agnes rushed back through the rain, the situation was already incredibly dire. Judith was burning with a high fever, and swollen lumps had appeared on her neck, the classic symptoms of the plague. The whole family gathered around Judith, trying every possible remedy, but nothing could stop her condition from worsening. The mother-in-law had already lost 3 daughters to the plague. She knew that once infected, hope was slim. Just like when Judith was born, she once again urged Agnes to give up. Agnes continued to persist, but a miracle didn't happen. She pushed herself until she fell into an exhausted sleep, and Judith remained unconscious. Waking up in the middle of the night, Hamnet quietly walked to the bedside, perhaps due to a twin connection. Under his gentle calling, Judith opened her eyes, but she was impossibly weak. In this sorrowful atmosphere, Hamnet felt as though he saw the shadow of death. He wanted to tell death to take him and Judith together, but suddenly, he remembered the switching game they always played. Struggling with all his might, he moved Judith aside and lay down in the sickbed himself. Even though he was terrified, Hamnet firmly remembered his father's words, "Stay brave and protect your family." He loved them more than anything. Early the next morning, William, having received the news, was racing back home as fast as he could. At the exact same time, Hamnet found himself arriving in a strange, unfamiliar place. When Agnes woke up, she saw the siblings holding each other tightly. At her calling, Judith gave a faint response, but Hamnet could not be woken up. Agnes spiraled into absolute panic. Her deathbed vision of only having 2 children by her side had been a nightmare haunting her heart for years, but she had always assumed the child fated to die was the frail and sickly Judith. Therefore, she had poured all her favoritism into Judith, even knowing it was unfair to Hamnet, and she refused to move to London to protect her. What she never expected was that the first one to leave her would actually be Hamnet. She exhausted every method she could think of, but couldn't alleviate her son's suffering in the slightest. Agnes could only watch in despair as her son's little body convulsed in pain, and then life slipped away amidst her wails. Hamnet could no longer hear his mother's cries, nor could he see his father one last time. In that strange, otherworldly place, he walked toward a pitch-black doorway, leaving the mortal world behind, with one last glance full of longing. When William finally rushed into the house, the first thing he saw was Judith. All the anxiety from his journey instantly melted into joy. He excitedly picked up his daughter, hugging her tightly, but very quickly, he felt the suffocating atmosphere of grief in the room. And then he saw the child covered in a white sheet. He suddenly realized what had happened, but he didn't want to believe it, didn't dare to believe it. However terrifying the truth was, he eventually had to face it. Summoning all his courage, William pulled back the white cloth, and saw that small, familiar yet lifeless face. Agnes, however, could never accept this outcome. She locked herself in her room, washing her face with tears all day long. She deeply regretted not paying more attention to Hamnet earlier. Her guilt and agony morphed into a hard, thorny emotional shell, sealing off her heart completely, and piercing anyone who dared to get close to her. William knew his wife was blaming him for not being there when his family needed him the most. But he had no way to explain himself, because he truly had failed his duties as a husband and a father. To make matters worse, he was about to leave his grieving family behind again to head to London for a performance. Agnes completely lost control. William hugged her tightly, but while she could control her physical struggles, she couldn't control her emotional devastation. With a cold face, she drove her husband away. William's performances in London were a massive success. He used the money he earned to buy precious bracelets and bought a large house, but he could never win his wife's forgiveness. Agnes was initially drawn to William because she saw incredible things within his mind: vast spaces, deep caves, cliff-tops, tunnels, and oceans, undiscovered countries. She told William to go to London so he could turn those inner landscapes into reality, but after Hamnet died, she began to resent him for it. The most terrifying part was, when she grabbed William's hand again, she saw nothing at all. The man she had once loved deeply seemed to have completely vanished. She told William to go back to London, because without him, she could survive just fine. Returning to London, William was consumed by extreme anguish. He blamed himself, drowning in regret, constantly wondering where Hamnet was in whatever he did. He felt as if his son had merely wandered off, and was surely waiting somewhere for him to find him. The thought was driving him utterly mad. Watching the actors rehearse with flat, emotionless delivery finally ignited the fury he had suppressed for so long. His outburst was less about directing and more about purging his soul. He was using the dialogue to vent his deep self-loathing, but agony is not easily dispelled. At night, he went down to the river, contemplating ending his own life, staring into the pitch-black water. He couldn't bring himself to do it. Suffering is the true cradle of literature. Amidst his immense pain, William realized his dream and created an immortal masterpiece. Yet, he probably wished he had never had to pick up the pen. Choosing to fight his grief, he channeled his agony into fuel, obsessing over every single detail of his play, striving for absolute perfection. Agnes was completely unaware of all this, until her stepmother came to visit. Only then did she find out that her husband's new play shared a name just one letter apart from their son's. Filled with confusion and doubt, she and her brother tracked down William's residence in London. They were astonished to discover that the famous William was living in a tiny, cramped attic. This sight tore a crack right through Agnes's hardened shell. Back then, she and William had married in a similarly cramped attic. She realized her husband had never forgotten his home, his family, and he had never truly changed. Persuaded by her brother, she decided to go see her husband's play. The theater was packed tight with crowds. Agnes followed the crowd into the place where her husband worked. This was her very first time being here. Looking at the expectant eyes of the people around her, she felt as if she were seeing that magnificent landscape she had once seen inside her husband's mind. But when she heard an actor yell out Hamlet, her wounds were violently torn open again. The nightmare-like memories came flooding back. She didn't want to think of that name, nor did she want to hear anyone else say it. She couldn't bear to stay a second longer, turning away in a frantic rush to escape. But when the actor playing Hamlet stepped onto the stage, her feet were glued to the floor. His sharp, distinct features looked exactly like what an older Hamnet would have been. She stared at the actor, mesmerized, unwilling to miss a single detail, as if the person standing on stage right now was the boy who had grown up safely and realized his dreams, Hamnet. When the ghost, played by William, appeared on stage, she could no longer hold back her tears. It felt as though she was witnessing a dream, the father and son performing on the same stage. At this moment, Agnes finally understood. She had believed she was the only one who deeply loved their son, the only one agonizing over his passing, even blaming William for only caring about his work and ignoring his family. But the truth was, all this time, William had buried his unbearable grief deep inside his heart. Through the stage, he poured out all the words he never got to say to his son. This was no longer just a play, it was a father's profound, desperate longing for his boy. It was the regret of missing that final goodbye, and it was the most sincere gift he could offer. William adapted his son's name to create a valiant prince, bringing the dreams his son never lived to see onto the stage. Agnes was completely immersed. When Hamlet fought his enemies, she felt excited and terrified, and when Hamlet emerged victorious, she clapped with pure joy. But when the prince was poisoned and collapsed to the floor, her heart tightly clenched again, as if she were watching her son die all over again. She couldn't help but reach out her hand, grasping the prince's hand in her mind, and soon, countless hands reached out around her. The prince's death moved everyone in the theater to tears. In this shared atmosphere of sorrow, Agnes locked eyes with William. The two shared a knowing, tearful smile. In that exact moment, the heavy knot in Agnes's heart completely unraveled. By reuniting with Hamnet through the magic of theater, she finally found release. History always remembers the one shining in the spotlight, but forgets to ask who was holding the lantern behind the scenes. It was her. She pushed that man toward greatness, and then that man left, stepping out into a much larger world, leaving her alone in the claustrophobic small town to care for 3 children, care for her mother-in-law, and manage all the days of his absence. She opened that door for him with her own hands, and then sat alone on the threshold, waiting for the wind from that door to occasionally blow back her way. This isn't just a tragedy, this is the true reality of many women's lives. She sacrificed for someone else's grand ambitions, but no one ever asked her where were her own grand ambitions. However, regarding their son's death, Agnes's view was narrow. She thought she was the only one in pain, the only one who deeply loved their son, believing the man was just an empty shell, a heartless machine. But often, a man's love is silent. Some people's tears don't fall on their faces, they bleed in their hearts. He won't hold you and break down with you, but in the dead of night, he will write your name into the very masterpiece he sheds blood to create. When the movie ends, Agnes finally finds peace. Not because the pain has vanished, but because she finally sees William. He had never forgotten them, he was just missing his son in a completely different way, and loving him just the same. Alright, that's it for today's recap. If you liked it, remember to follow, like, and comment. That's all for now, see you in the next one.